Hi, students! Today is the final day of the legislative session, and Marissa and I thought it would be fun to be here together to wrap up the session by talking about some of the highlights of the past 60 days, as well as what has been occurring since we last reported to you. This week has been all about three things. 1, concurrence. 2, those initiatives. And 3, the budget. So, let's get into it. I know that's one of your favorite phrases. Remember, all bills have to pass out of both houses with the exact same language. Not even a comma can be different. The process that the houses go through is called concurrence. So, Marissa, did you see any interesting bills this week that had to go through this process before being sent to the governor's desk?
Yes, I did. So there were a lot of bills that needed to be concurred to because it is really common for legislators to keep messing with bills during the whole process. When I looked up what was left that had gone through all the floor votes, I found about 10 Senate bills and 1 House bill still in dispute. And the bill from the House is one related to requiring financial education classes as a graduation requirement, HB 1915. The bill phases in making the classes available by the start of the 2027 school year, so it wouldn't be a graduation requirement until 2031. And as far as I can tell, it seems like the Senate doesn't think this should be a graduation requirement and would rather make sure it is accessible by allowing flexibility in how the curriculum is adopted. So maybe that means a standalone class, or maybe that means putting financial education lessons into something like a math class. And this bill is also pretty neat because it was initiated by a student from the Tri-Cities, Ashwin Joshi. Procedurally, after 1915 was sent back to the House by the Senate, the House refused to concur and asked the Senate for a conference committee. And the Senate said no.
No?
No. So that doesn't happen very often. So it's fascinating to see on the bill history page. And if no one agrees, the bill will die, which would totally be a shame. I would have loved to have some financial education when I was in high school instead of having to learn everything as an adult.
I know that the Department of the Treasury, the treasurer, also was sponsoring this bill.
Yeah, he testified on it during committee.
I know that he'll be sad if it dies as well. So, Marissa, can you explain the conference committee step a little bit for the students? When I was in the gallery for a floor vote, I saw Senator Hawkins be very excited to be put on a conference committee for a bill to come to a final resolution.
Yeah, these are not very fun at the end of session, as it tends to happen with contested bills. So each chamber will assign legislators to hash things out during a special meeting. And the final result could actually go several ways. The bill could go back to one of the versions that was passed by the House or the Senate. It could also end up entirely different than what was previously seen as a sort of compromise, depending on how far things are apart. Or conference committees are really a last resort to get agreement on a bill, but it doesn't always work out. So the bill could die if the committee can't come to agreement.
So this is yet another way for a bill to die.
Yeah.
So you can think that your bill's going to make it the whole way through, and then at this point,
if it's in dispute,
it could die.
It could die.
All right, so last day, here we go. So, say a bill does make it out of the conference committee. What steps can the governor take once the bill is placed on his desk?
Yeah, the steps are the same as any other bill that makes it to the governor's desk. He can sign the bill, and everyone at the signing ceremony gets to take home a little pen.
I have one of those.
It's really fun. He could sign the bill, but do a partial veto, where maybe there's a section or two that he decides for whatever reason to cross out, and then only part of the bill becomes law. Or he could veto the entire bill. So that doesn't happen often, but it is possible, especially if the budget doesn't fund the bill in the way it's supposed to.
Do you think he's going to veto the budget this year?
There's probably sections that he will cross out because that happens every year, but we don't see a whole lot.
So now let's talk about those initiatives. 3 of the initiatives passed through the House and the Senate this week, and they'll now be passed into law. how are these initiatives different from other pieces of legislation?
So when someone decides to work on an initiative, they have the option to first send it to Olympia rather than directly to the ballot. And that's what happened here with all 6 initiatives this year. And there are different timelines between doing an initiative to the legislature and an initiative that goes to the ballot. But there are also strategy decisions that have to be made. So maybe the sponsors wanted to send a specific message to legislators and to voters, which is definitely what happened here, since most of these initiatives are about legislation that was passed by the majority Democrats in the last several years. Now, after these bills like the Climate Commitment Act and the capital gains tax were passed, individuals could have run referendums to overturn those bills the same year they were passed. So the 3 initiatives that passed through the House and the Senate will now go to the Secretary of State to be certified, but they don't need to be signed by the governor like other pieces of legislation.
So that's interesting. So the initiatives and bill-making processes are similar, but different in some pretty important ways.
Yeah, and there's also a certain number of signatures that have to be gathered depending on what route you go through, too. So there's a lot of technical steps that the Secretary of State has to certify.
So it's just yet another way for individuals to get involved in the bill-making process.
Exactly.
That's great. So I did watch some of the public hearings, the executive sessions, and the floor debates on these 3 initiatives that are going to be passed into law. There were some impassioned people on both sides of the issues. So that makes me wonder, can legislators make any changes to these new laws in the 2025 legislative session?
So that is actually something that legislators were asking legal counsel before they decided to hear the bills. And it is also probably why we heard so many technical questions about what is or isn't changed by something like the Parent Information Bill. So if legislators had decided to make changes this year, that would send competing initiatives to the ballot, and that's really confusing. So it wasn't an option. Now, generally, legislation isn't supposed to be changed for about 2 years after it initially passes, but I see topics get revisited year after year after year.
I see. So they pass it into law, and then technically for 2 years, it should just stay the way it is. And then maybe in 2026, they could try to make some amendments to that law.
Right.
All right, that's interesting. So now for the budget. On Monday morning, the Senate voted to not concur with the House amendments to the budget, and they invoked a conference committee to hammer out the details on the budget. What they came out with was a compromise between both bodies. How do you think these compromises will affect the implementation of important legislation voted on this year?
So remember, the Senate funds Senate bills and the House funds House bills. The final budget now includes, in theory, all the bills that need funding so they don't become null and void because of all of those clauses that Rep. Ormsby loves so much. I have seen some numbers adjusted in the final budget, and that can happen for several different reasons. So maybe the fiscal note changed after the original budget proposals were released because something in the bill was changed. Or maybe budget writers thought a fiscal note wasn't quite accurate before. Now that could be either too high or too low. But the real problem is when it is glaringly obvious that a bill was not even close to being appropriately funded. And that's when Governor Inslee will consider a veto, like we talked about before, on the legislation and the proviso that goes with it. We'll actually find out if that is the case once we start seeing more bills get signed by the governor, because his office will put together documents that explain why something was vetoed, and all of that is public. So ultimately, state agencies really do have to do their best to implement the new laws that affect them, even if the funding isn't quite what they wanted.
So even if they pass their bill into law and they get the go-ahead from the legislature and the governor to make this thing happen, and they don't get enough money, they still have to do it.
They still have to do it.
Wow.
Yep.
It must be challenging for them. So it's now the interim. So what can and really what should students do to further their advocacy on causes that they really care about?
All right. First and foremost, take some time to get session out of your system. Reconnect with nature. Watch some movies or truly do whatever makes you happy and get all those end of session big feelings out of your body.
I'm gonna sleep.
Yeah, same here. I mean, truly, breaks are really important, and no one in Olympia wants to hear from anyone for at least a month. So anyway, after that, legislators and their staff are back at home in their districts, right? So that means they are available for meetings if you want to schedule time. During interim, meetings are generally 30 minutes, although I have done hour-long meetings if there are, enough things to talk about, or if the legislator decides they have a lot of things that they want to cover with you. And since this is an election year, be sure to check that your senator or representatives will actually be around in 2025, because truly a lot of folks are deciding to retire and just be done. So if they are planning to stick around, you could actually look up their campaign information and see if you want to volunteer. And campaigns love having people available to go doorbelling, and you can get a lot of practice talking to new people. If you want to talk about an idea for legislation for next year, you should start shopping that around sooner rather than later. Legislative staff also have a lot more time on their hands during interim to do special projects, and figuring out how to draft legislation is a really good project between now and Halloween. But again, make sure your legislative champion will actually be around in 2025 so you don't waste your time or anyone else's. And now is also a great time to follow up on anything that passed this year and to ask the staff, hey, what does that bill actually do? I've done this sort of thing when I've called my own legislators, and it's a great strategy so you can have a real conversation on the issue with the staff, and it keeps things friendly. Lastly, never forget to always be nice. It's lesson 101 for relationship building, and it really makes a difference if you want legislators to support your ideas.
For sure. And I know that a lot of bills, become studies and things like that. That might be a good question of so what does this bill actually do? What is this study going to actually implement?
Yeah, or is there going to be some kind of follow-up legislation on the study once the report is done and submitted to the legislature?
And that would be a great place for students to become involved there as well.
Exactly.
Awesome. Now, Marissa, I hear that you might also have a couple questions for me.
I do. So now that you've been embedded in Olympia as part of the Teach with TVW team, what was something that surprised you about session?
I think what's really exciting and unfortunately surprising, because I wish more people knew about this, is how much legislators actually want to hear from the public. While it may make the public hearings really long, and I saw a lot of really long public hearings, I've seen many legislators on both sides of the aisle, so Republicans and Democrats, be so appreciative of people's time as they come to the hearing rooms to testify. They like it when they're testifying virtually. They really appreciate when people can make it all the way to Olympia, but they also understand that people don't have the ability to do that, so they're really excited to be there.
All right, what is one piece of advice that you have for the Capitol Classroom teachers and students as they continue to learn about and hopefully continue to be engaged in civic education?
All right, the first thing that I have definitely learned as a civics teacher, but now that I am here, don't give up. Legislation takes a lot of time, and frankly, it's a real benefit of the system that it takes so long. Take the time to listen to the points of view of the people that you don't agree with you. This is going to benefit you in numerous ways, but in terms of advocacy, it makes you a much better advocate for what you believe in if you know the arguments that people will present about your cause. Also, this is something that's really been nailed into my head since I've been here. Pay attention to the budget, the money. Pay attention to how much things cost. We can't print Washington bucks here in the state of Washington. We only have so much money, so they can only afford so many things. So do your financial homework. Maybe that bill that we talked about at the beginning will get passed so that you will have that financial literacy education so that you can do that homework.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point about listening to both sides. That's something that I've definitely worked on as a lobbyist, about how I get my message across no matter who I'm talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. And hearing that other side really helps you clarify what you actually believe. And so let's do more of that, y'all. So thanks for joining us in Capitol Classroom this year.
Be sure to stay engaged and feel free to reach out with any questions.
We'll see you in the 2025 session.
Peace.